Why Israel? Another topic in our course on the Pentateuch. By establishing a special covenant relationship with Israel, the Lord set them apart from all other nations as His people. God's choice is not based on their special quality, it is not due to their righteousness. God's intention is that they should be a light to other nations. That's a privilege and a responsibility. Due to the covenant with God, Israel enjoys a relationship with the Lord that differs from the experience of other nations. But why Israel? God has chosen Israel out of all the people on the face of the earth, not Israel who chose the Lord. The Israelites are to be His people. No other nation can claim such a status. They are God's treasured possession. The term treasured possession refers to the jewels and valuable objects in a king's treasury. And they are also called to be a holy nation. They should exhibit the holiness of God's nature. So why was Israel chosen? Not because they were numerous. Actually, they are the fewest of all the people. Not because of their righteousness. They are stiff-necked and rebellious people. Moreover, Deuteronomy tells us that they will be unable to fulfill the obligations placed on them. So why? God's love for them and faithfulness to the oath He swore to their ancestors is the reason. The election of Israel resulted from the Lord's unmerited love for them. What is the purpose of their election? Israel was divinely chosen to be an example for others to emulate. No other gods are so near like God of Israel to their people. No other nation possesses such righteous decrees and laws like the Torah. By being called to be an example, Israel has obligation to live up to their calling. The Torah was made for the purpose to make them more righteous than the other nations. Called to be a righteous nation, place an obligation on them that there should be no evil among them. However, being God's treasured possession does not guarantee that they will always enjoy divine favor. If they do not meet the obligations of the covenant, the curse will follow. Israel and other nations. There is an important distinction between the nations living in Canaan and those living elsewhere. There are 7 nations in the land of Canaan, in the Promised Land, and they had to be driven out. The expulsion of the nations living in Canaan is an act of divine punishment. They were sinful nations, and the land could not bear them any longer. But they also need to be removed so as not to tempt Israel to idolatry and sinfulness. How about nations outside of Canaan? We have the examples of 3, Edomites, Moabites, and Ammonites. Israelites are not allowed to attack them. God granted those nations their land, and Israel has no right to take it from them. Aside from these 3 nations, when it comes to dealing with other nations, before fighting a war with them, the Israelites first should present an offer of peace, and only if such offer is rejected, proceed to war. Election and responsibility. Elected by the Lord, they were never forced into that covenant. At Sinai and on the plains of Moab, just before entering the promised land, they are invited to freely enter into a covenant relationship with the Lord. However, once the covenant was made, they are obliged to be loyal to the Lord. Despite all exhortations to obedience and threats for disobedience, Deuteronomy conveys an idea that Israel will fail in its commitment. The land will be devastated and the people exiled into Babylon. Moses is sure that they will fail based on knowing their character. After all, they are stiff-necked people. And when this happens, the nations shall ask, why such disaster have come upon them? The answer is, they have abandoned their God. However, as in all those stories in the Bible, there is always hope. Their repentance will lead to God's compassion. Israel will experience or have a promise of a heart surgery that will allow them to fulfill their obligations. New Testament connections. Israel's election is prominent in the letter to the Romans. In Romans chapter 9, verses 4 and 5, we read about the benefits that belongs to Israel. Example, the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the service of God, and the promises, and most of all, Jesus Christ, who according to the flesh came from the people of Israel. St. Paul also speaks about Torah as the embodiment of knowledge and truth, and he also mentions the inability to fulfill God's law. However, God deals with this inability by providing his own righteousness. We read the famous passage in the letter to the Romans, chapter 3, verses 21-22. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. Those who, like Paul, accepted God's righteousness, trusting in Jesus, are justified. Finally, although some failed to attain righteousness, the Lord did not reject his people. Saint Paul reveals to us a mystery, that all Israel will be saved.